The waves broke in silence. A grey sea rolled gently beneath a cold northern sky, the kind of sky that offers no warmth, only witness. A pale mist clung to the water's surface, shrouding everything beyond a few ship lengths in a veil of ghostly uncertainty. Then, out of that stillness, came a shape, long, low, and blackened by fire. It was a ship, at least it had been. Now it drifted aimlessly, rudder gone, sail torn to ribbons, its hull cracked open by heat and time. Smoke rose from the charred ribs of the vessel in thin tendrils, curling skyward as though reluctant to leave the dead behind. No oars moved. No voices cried. Only the hiss of smouldering timber whispered into the air. From the bluffs above the coast, the monks at the Abbey of Reculver watched in stunned silence. It had come in the night, unseen until the tide brought it to shore. They had rung no bells. None had dared approach. The abbot, a man of 50 winters with hands calloused from parchment and prayer, stood transfixed. His lips moved, muttering fragments of Latin psalms meant to ward off evil. But no scripture could explain what lay before them. The ship was a coffin, a floating grave. The form of a man lay visible amid the blackened planks, half consumed by fire, but still draped in what had once been finery. Around him, scattered like relics, were the remains of weapons. A sword hilt fused with bone, a shattered round shield, the head of an axe scorched but unmistakable. At the bow, beneath a scorched animal pelt, lay the curled body of a dog or perhaps a wolf-its skull, grinning as if mocking death. And then there were the runes. Carved into the stern post, still visible beneath the soot, was a jagged inscription, neither Latin nor Greek. The monks did not understand the words, but they understood the threat. For weeks afterward, they would whisper of it in cloisters and scriptoria, a northern rite, pagan sorcery, a warning. It would not be the last. What the monks had witnessed that morning was no mere accident of tide and fire. It was a Viking death ship, part tomb, part message. In the Norse world, death was not hidden. It was paraded, burned, and consecrated with spectacle. And when Vikings died, especially men of renowned chieftains, warlords, berserkers, or seers, their bodies were not interred with quiet reverence in cold earth. They were sent to sea. Sometimes the ship was buried whole beneath mounds of earth. Sometimes it was dragged onto the shore, filled with grave goods and servants, and then set aflame as kin sang to the gods and wolves howled in the forest. And sometimes it was set adrift, burning, into the open seamient to carry the dead to Valhalla or the underworld, depending on the god's favour. To their enemies across Europe, these funerals were more than pagan blasphemy. They were terrifying performances, ritualized defiance of Christian burial, a challenge to death itself, and a symbol of Viking invincibility. The sight of one such ship drifting ashore sent a clear message. We honour our dead with ships and fire. What will you do when we return for the living? The death ship was not invented by the Vikings, but they perfected it. Its origins likely stretch deep into the Iron Age, when seafaring peoples first began associating boats with the journey to the afterlife. But it was the Norse, those farmers turned raiders from the fjords of Norway and the coasts of Denmark and Sweden, who forged this idea into a cultural weapon. To them, the ship was not simply transportation. It was cosmology in timber and iron. It was the means by which a soul passed from the mortal realm into the next. The ship cut through water as the soul cut through realms, from Midgard to the other worlds, Asgard, Helheim, or the dark depths beneath the world tree Yggdrasil. In Norse poetry, warriors slain in battle did not simply die. They were chosen by Valkyries and carried away, not by angels, but by longships of fire and fate. The warrior's voyage continued in death. And for the living, that voyage had to be made visible. Imagine the coastline of Northumbria, or the rocky beaches of Galicia. It is the 9th century. Dawn breaks over the eastern sea. A sentry from a coastal village spots smoke on the horizon. Not a fleet, just one ship. But it is ablaze, drifting silently, its sails sagging, its contents a mystery. The scent of charred oak and resin reaches the shore. What does the sentry see? He sees defiance, he sees ritual, he sees a people who have made death their banner. And perhaps he wonders, what will happen when such men come, not with the dead, but with the living? This was the true terror of the Viking death ship. Not its fire, not its cargo, but the idea it carried across the waves, that to these people, death was not defeat, it was a victory, And if this was how they honored the fallen, then how would they fight for the living? The monks at Reculver never touched the ship. It remained on the shore for days, a scorched monument to another world. Eventually, the tide claimed it. Or perhaps some peasant, some thief, some sailor crept out at night and took what remained. But the memory stayed. Across Europe, from the Loire to the Volga, such ships would come again and again, bearing not just the dead, but the weight of a belief system that refused to bow, that wrapped fire around bones and sent them to sea, daring gods and men alike to deny its power. This is the story of those ships. The Vikings did not flee from death, they courted it. To understand why the Viking death ship was feared across Europe, we must first understand the people who built it, not just the shipwrights and warriors, but the cosmology that shaped their courage and their cruelty. The Norse were not resigned to death as a quiet inevitability. They embraced it as a vital, even sacred force. For them, death was not a door that closed, it was a path that opened. This belief did not arise from idle superstition. It was woven into every part of Viking life, their stories, their customs, their rituals, their very architecture. In a world where winters could kill and the sea claimed lives without apology, the Norse turned fear into reverence. They did not deny the darkness, they named it, sang about it, built their worldview around it. At the heart of this worldview stood Yggdrasil, the world tree, an immense ash whose roots and branches held together the 9 realms. Among these were Midgard, the world of men, Asgard, the realm of the gods, and Helheim, the cold, distant underworld. When a man died, he did not vanish, journeyed. His soul passed along one of many roads, guided by spirits or gods, depending on the nature of his life and death. There was no single afterlife in Norse belief. There were many, and the road you travelled depended on how you died. For the common folk, those who died of age or illness, the path often led to Helheim, shadowy, neutral realm ruled by Hel, the half-rotted daughter of Loki. It was not a place of torment, but it was far from glorious. To die in bed was to fade. But for warriors, especially those who died with weapon in hand and valor in heart, another fate awaited. These chosen few were whisked away to Valhalla, Odin's golden hall of the slain, where they would feast, fight, and train for Ragnarok, the final battle at the end of all things. It was this promised glory in death that shaped the Viking soul. Imagine a boy named Eric, 12 winters old, growing up on a coastal farmstead in Nordfjord. His grandfather, a grey-bearded skald, tells tales by firelight, of Sigurd who slew the dragon Fafnir and was bathed in blood, of Brynhilda, the shield maiden who defied Odin, of warriors whose names echoed in the sagas because they chose death over dishonor. Eric learns early that courage is currency, that wounds are marks of worth, that a warrior who fears death cannot hope to dine among the Einherjar fallen warriors of Valhalla. By the time he is 16, he has carved his first runes into his shield, kissed his mother's cheek for the last time, and sailed west with a crew of men twice his age. And when his shipmate dies in battle, his axe buried in a Saxon's chesterick helps prepare the body, knowing exactly what must be done. They do not bury him quietly. They light the fire. They sing the chants. They raise his sword beside him. He will not go alone into the next world. He will go with fire. He will go with honor. This cultural expectation shaped more than just funerary rites, it shaped every battle, every raid, every choice. Viking raiders did not wear death like a burden, they wore it like armor. If they died in battle, they died well. If they lived, they returned richer, more honored, more dangerous. This was not bravado, it was theology. Even their gods lived within this cycle of death and rebirth. Odin, the Allfather, sacrificed himself to himself, hanging from the world tree for 9 days and nights, pierced by a spear, to gain the wisdom of the runes. Thor, the Thunderer, was fated to die in Ragnarok, even as he slew the world serpent Jörmungandr. These were not immortal gods in the Greco-Roman sense. They bled, they suffered, they faced the end. Their followers imitated them. The Sagastos, long oral histories, later written down in Icelandair, filled with stoic reflections on mortality. One man, facing death, says simply, "Cattle die, kinsmen die, you yourself shall die. But one thing I know, that never dies the fame of a dead man's deeds." This was the Norse epitaph, not the memory of comfort, but the echo of action. Thus, The Viking death ship was not merely a coffin. It was the last act of a life lived with mythic purpose. It was the stage on which the dead man's final image would be burned into the minds of the living. And to those watching from afar, from Irish monks to Frankish knights to Slavic villagers, that spectacle was terrifying, because it revealed a truth more chilling than fire. The Norse did not fear death. They invited it. They prepared for it their entire lives. They trained not to avoid it, but to meet it well. When their chieftains died, they did not whisper prayers. They gathered wood. They sharpened axes. They sang. The death ship, then, was the embodiment of a worldview that stood in stark contrast to Christian European world that buried its dead, mourned with sorrow, and feared the fires of hell. The Norse lit their fires on purpose, not to punish, but to elevate. And the message was clear. This is how we treat the dead. Imagine what we do to the living. The Viking longship was more than a vessel of war. It was a floating declaration of identity, fear, and fate. Sleek, fast, and lethal, it could traverse oceans and rivers alike, but its purpose transcended the material. To the Norse, the longship was not just a machine of wood and iron. It was myth, it was ritual, it was the spine of their civilization. From the moment a tree was felled in the cold forests of Norway or the pine-strewn hills of Sweden, the process of shaping a longship began with reverence. Shipwrights didn't simply build, they invoked. Wood was seasoned, iron nails forged with care. The curvature of the hull, the symmetry of the keel, the elegance of the bowel of it mattered, because this ship would not only carry men to distant shores, one day it might carry a soul to the afterlife. The longship was dual in nature. In times of war, it was a predator. In times of death, it was a shrine. Let us first consider its warlike function. No weapon in the Viking arsenal was more feared across Europe than the longship. With shallow drafts and flexible hulls, these vessels could glide through rivers, skirt the shallows, and land on beaches others would deem impassable. Their arrival was swift and devastating. To a coastal monastery, the longship on the horizon meant one thing: the wolves had come. From Lindisfarne to Nantes, from Dublin to Constantinople, longships became the harbingers of fire and iron. Their dragon-headed prows weren't merely ornamental. They were psychological weapons, carved to frighten spirits and men alike. The shape, the symmetry, the impossible silence of their approach, they came with the mist, they left with blood. But beneath the sails and shields lay something deeper. To the Norse, the longship was a vessel of cosmic resonance. It mirrored the journey of the soul, the seafaring metaphor for the path from Midgard to the realms beyond. The ship did not simply cross water, it crossed worlds. And so, when a great warrior or a jarl died, his kin did not bury him in a pit like a peasant. They laid him in a ship. In some cases, the vessel was burn its flames, lifting the soul skyward. In others, it was buried, mounded over with earth, as if the ship was sailing beneath the soil, a submarine of spirit. In both cases, the ship remained a bridge between the living and the dead, the known and the unknown. Archaeological evidence affirms this duality. The Oseberg and Gokstad ships, excavated in Norway, were both intended as funerary monuments. Their hulls were filled with grave goodstools, textiles, animals, sleds, even a cart. The bodies inside were laid out with ceremonial precision. These were not random burials. They were carefully constructed statements of legacy. Imagine, for a moment, the villagers watching as such a ship was pulled ashore one final time. Ropes straining, men singing solemn chants. The body, dressed in furs and chainmail, lowered into the hull beside his sword and drinking horn. Dogs, perhaps sacrificed. Horses, their breath visible in the cold. The priestess, the vulva chanting as the fire was lit or the mound heaped high. This was not just a funeral, it was a ritualized exit into eternity. And it mattered who watched. The message of the death ship was never purely for the gods. It was for the living, for the clan, for the rivals, for the distant king or fearful Christian monks across the sea. The longship, whether charging into a river or resting atop a barrow, always spoke the same truth: we are unafraid. Thus, the longship became a weapon not only of war, but of memory. A man who sailed such a vessel in life, and lay within it in death, had entered the mythic cycle of Norse cosmology. His name might live on in sagas, his deeds passed down in verse, but the ship, was the eternal witness. It is this dual symbolism that made Viking longships so feared. To face one was to face both warrior and wraith. You were not merely repelling a raid, you were confronting a culture that believed its very ships were sacred. Even after the flames died, the message lingered. The longship was gone, but the image remained. The dragon that bore a soul to the gods, a shape that moved across water and sky with equal ease. A Viking death ship was many things: a tomb, a symbol, a threat, and a prayer. It was not one single practice, but a spectrum of funerary traditions centered around the longship, arguably the most iconic structure the Norse ever crafted. While popular imagination often conjures a single, flaming ship adrift at sea, the historical reality was far more complex, more varied, and in many ways, more terrifying. To define the Viking death ship is to enter the tangled roots of Norse cosmology, ritual, and warfare. At its core, it was a funeral rite. But unlike a Christian grave, a death ship did not simply mark an end, it marked a beginning. The ship was a vehicle not only for the dead body, but for the soul. It was a ritual vessel meant to carry the departed into the next world. There were several forms a Viking death ship could take. The most famous, and perhaps the rarest, was the ship that was set alight and pushed out to sea, its sails unfurling as fire consumed its hull. The body of the dead king, jarl, or honored warrior lay amid his weapons, his gold, and sometimes his servants. Flames licked the wood, smoke rose into the sky, the sea carried him away into legend. But this was only one expression of a broader tradition. More commonly, the ship was buried. A real longship, often smaller than those used for warfare, was pulled inland and laid in a trench. The body of the deceased was positioned at the center, surrounded by grave goods, armor, weapons, food, drinking vessels, tools, sometimes even livestock or human sacrifices. The hull was then covered in earth and stone, forming a barrow mound that resembled a ship still cutting through waves, frozen in time beneath the soil. In some cases, the ship was symbolic. Stones were laid in the outline of a longship on the ground. The dead were buried within that shape, and the ship itself, though invisible to the sky, was present in spirit. These stone ship burials, found throughout Scandinavia and even into the Baltic regions, reinforced the cosmological significance of the vessel without the need for timber. But regardless of form, flaming, buried, or symbolic, the death ship always carried a message. The dead are not gone, they are sailing. Take, for example, the burial at Oseberg. Discovered in 1904 and dating to the early 9th century, it contained the remains of 2 high-status women, one likely a queen or priestess. The ship was lavish, 1 feet long, with 15 oar holes on each side. Carvings of intertwined beasts adorned its prow. Inside were intricately woven tapestries, carved sleighs, animal remains, and personal possessions. The burial was clearly ceremonial, but it was also functional. This was no ordinary coffin. This was a soul's transport. Then there is the Gokstad ship, another burial of extraordinary grandeur. The man entombed there was likely a powerful chieftain or warrior. He lay surrounded by weapons, gaming boards, sleds, and sacrificed animals. His ship, like Oseberg's, was seaworthy. Had he lived, it might have carried him to battle. In death, it carried him to another kind of war. These burials were not secret. They were not modest. They were public theatre. Entire communities would witness the ritual. In some cases, the dead might be displayed for days before burial, dressed in full finery, as final rites were performed. Fires were lit. Skalds recited sagas. Volvasnor Sirises might chant or perform rites to ease the soul's journey. There could be sacrifices, sometimes of horses, sometimes of thralls. The presence of blood did not sully the event. It sanctified it. Such grandeur was not for everyone. These death ships were reserved for the powerful, the wealthy, the legendary. A farmer who died of old age in his bed might receive a simple burial. But a war chief who died on foreign soil? A berserker slain in a frenzy? A Volva whose visions shook the clan? These were the candidates for the ship. The practice was also not limited to Scandinavia. The Salme ship burials in Estonia, dating to around 750 CE, predate the official beginning of the Viking Age. 2 ships, partially buried side by side, contain the remains of dozens of Scandinavian warriors. Weapons, gaming pieces, falcon bone sit, was not just a mass grave. It was a ritualized statement of presence. These men died far from home, but their burial bound them eternally to Norse tradition. Even in death, they were not defeated. The sight of such funerals shocked and unnerved neighboring peoples. Arab travelers wrote of Vikings who sent their dead to sea in burning ships, surrounded by offerings. Christian monks condemned the practices as pagan madness, heathen pyres and howling songs, one called them. But beneath their revulsion was fear. The Norse did not treat death with fear or shame. They celebrated it. To outsiders, this defiance was frightening. To see fire on the water, to hear chants in a strange tongue, to witness a body sent forth with gold and blood it, was to witness a people who embraced death, not as punishment, but as passage. This is what made the Viking death ship so powerful. It was not just a ritual, it was a philosophy in motion, a final act of courage, a floating shrine to the idea that death, properly faced, could be glorious, that the sea was not an ending, but a path, and that even in death, the Norse would never be small. Before the Viking Age announced itself with the fiery raid on Lindisfarne in 793 CE, before the Norse had burned their names into the scrolls of terrified monks, there was Salm. On the quiet, wind-battered coast of what is now Saaremaa, an Estonian island in the Baltic Sea, something extraordinary was buried more than 1,000 years ago. Hidden beneath centuries of sand and forest growth lay two ships. Not wrecks, not relics, graves. They would remain undisturbed until the early 21st century, when construction crews stumbled upon something strange in the soil. Rivets, bones, blades. What followed was one of the most astonishing archaeological discoveries in Viking history. The site, dated to around 750 CE, contained the remains of two overlapping ships, laid side by side, with the bones of at least 40 Scandinavian warriors. This was Salmea death ship site older than Lindisfarne, older than the term Viking itself. Here, among the dunes, lay the earliest physical evidence of Norsemen engaging in organized overseas conflict and honoring their dead with a burial so dramatic, so deliberate, it defied classification. This was not the chaotic grave of the fallen, it was theatre in wood and earth, a statement. The first ship was small, perhaps a scouting vessel, but the second, longer, heavier, better armed, was unmistakably a warship. Its hull had been pulled ashore, bodies laid in deliberate order along the keel line. They were not buried at random. These were ritual burials, suggesting rank, relationship, perhaps even kinship among the dead. And the artifacts told the rest of the story. Alongside the bodies were swordsome pattern welded, and of high craftsmanship spears, axe heads, arrow points, gaming pieces carved from antler, and remnants of decorated belts. A ceremonial falcon, buried with one of the highest-ranking warriors, suggested aristocratic status. Several men had wounds that bore the clear marks of close combat, fractured skulls, pierced ribs, deep cuts to femurs and spines. One man, lying near the prow, had suffered a blade through the eye, socket likely a death blow delivered face to face. Another bore the telltale mark of a decapitating strike. These men had died violently, but they had not been abandoned. They had been collected, reverently laid in their ship, given tribute, and buried with enough detail and care that their funeral could still be read like a saga 1,000 years later. Who buried them? The prevailing theory: their surviving comrades. Whoever these Norse warriors were, they were not alone. They died far from home, killed, in conflict with local tribes or rival seafarers, yet someone stayed behind. Someone took the time to organize a burial of exceptional scale, to dig the trenches, to position the bodies, to place the weapons, the falcon, the gaming boards, to cover the hulls in earth. Then they vanished. Perhaps they returned home, perhaps they died in the woods beyond, but they left behind the earliest known example of the Viking death ship, and in doing so, they ignited something more powerful than fire memory. The burial at Salmi is extraordinary, not just for its age or scale, but for what it reveals about Norse values before the Viking Age truly began. These men were not random pirates. They were part of an organized martial tradition. They honored their dead with ritual, with pageantry, with pride. And they saw the ship as the appropriate vehicle for passage into the afterlife, even far from the fjords. The Baltic Sea, even in the 8th century, was not a silent place. Trade routes threaded between tribes and coasts. Iron and amber passed through Finnish forests and Slavic river towns. But the Salm burial was different. It was martial, intentional. a declaration that Norse warriors could and would project power far from their own shores. And when they died in the attempt, they would not be left behind. The psychological effect of such a burial cannot be overstated. For the local people who might have stumbled upon the mound, the rivets still warm, the falcon's feathers curled by heat, it must have seemed like sorcery. What kind of people die this far from home and still bury their own like kings? What kind of warriors fall in blood and still command the discipline of ceremony? The answer: Norsemen. The men of Salme prefigured everything the Vikings would become, not merely raiders, but ritualists. Not merely killers, but keepers of a world view where death was sacred and the ship was salvation. Their burial was a blueprint, for the pyres lit on distant coasts, for the ships sent burning into the surf, for the barrows mounded over longships filled with bone and steel. In Salme, we glimpse the origin of the death ship. It was not an afterthought. It was not rare. It was how a Norse warrior died well. No image of the Vikings grips the imagination more fiercely than that of a longship burning against the dusk, its timbers crackling, its mast silhouetted in fire, its deck laden with the dead. It is the ultimate Viking rite, the funeral of fire and flesh. But this was no mere pyre. It was a ceremony of profound precision, shaped by myth, hierarchy, and cosmological urgency. The Viking funeral, especially when it involved a ship, was not only an act of mourning, it was a performance of power, a final declaration of identity, and a negotiation with the gods. To understand the depth of this ritual, we turn to one of the most detailed eyewitness accounts we possess, the 10th century Arab diplomat Ahmad ibn Fadlan, who observed the funeral of a Norse chieftain on the Volga River. Though the setting was among the Rus Norse traders and warriors settled in Eastern Europe, customs he described echo strongly with Scandinavian practice. His record is not just historical, it is visceral. When the chieftain died, his people did not bury him immediately. For 10 days, his body was placed in a temporary grave while preparations were made. His slaves asked who among them would volunteer to die with him. One woman, described as a concubine, stepped forward. She would be sacrificed to accompany him to the next world. A ship was pulled ashore. It was not a war vessel, but a purpose-built funeral boat, its keel lined with textiles, its bow curved like a serpent's neck. Inside, they placed the dead chieftain. Around him they arranged his goods, fruits, bread, mead, onions, herbs, his weapons, his shield, his axe, a dog, slaughtered, horses, sacrificed, 2 cows, all meant to serve him in the afterlife. Then came the girl. Ibn Fadlan writes with horror of what followed. The woman was led to the ship by an old woman known as the Angel of Death, likely a priestess or vulva, she chanted. She gave the girl intoxicants, perhaps mushrooms or fermented honeymead. The girl sang. She smiled. She entered the ship, climbed into her master's arms, and lay down. Then 6 men entered the boat. They encircled her. The Angel of Death took a dagger and pressed it to her chest. The 6 men strangled her with a rope while the blade pierced her ribs. This was not murder in their eyes. It was accompaniment. The girl believed she would see her master again, and the community believed she had to go with him. He must not journey alone. Once she was dead, her body was arranged beside the chieftain's. The Angel of Death circled the ship one final time. A pyre was built around it, wood soaked in pitch, oil, cloth. A torch was lit and passed forward. The fire began slowly, just a whisper. Then it grew into a scream. Flames climbed the mast, wrapped the rigging, devoured the textiles. Smoke rose in twisting columns, thick with pine, sap and hair and blood. The ship moaned as its ribs cracked in the heat, and then it was gone, reduced to embers and sky. The crowd wept, not from sorrow, but from awe. They had sent their leader to the other world with glory. And in doing so, they had affirmed the old truths, that life was battle, that death was a journey, and that to burn was to rise. Not all Viking ship funerals were so elaborate, but fire was a constant companion. In Scandinavia, cremation was an accepted and even honoured form of burial for centuries. Long before Christianity reached the fjords, the Norse were burning their dead, sometimes in pits, sometimes on raised pyres, sometimes on ships, and fire meant more than destruction. It meant liberation. Fire released the soul. It purified the flesh. It sent the essence skyward, smoke as a spirit offering to the gods. When paired with a ship, The symbolism was magnified. The soul did not just rise, it sailed. The materials used in these rituals mattered. Certain woods burned hotter, cleaner, birch for brightness, pine for fury, pitch was added for black smoke, for spectacle. Grave goods were carefully chosen. Swords were often bent before being beneath a symbolic killing of the weapon, so it might be reborn in the afterlife. Shields were scorched or shattered. Horses were sometimes slain with a single stroke to the neck, blood splattering across the prow like an offering. And always, the watchers stood in silence, or sang, or wept, not from grief but from reverence. Ritual chanting was common. Women played a vital role, some as mourners, others as seeresses. The vulva, with her staff and iron necklace, might lead the ceremony. She might call upon Odin or Freyja, guide the dead man's soul, interpret omens in the rising smoke. In some cases, the body was burned at sea, the ship set adrift, then fired by archers on the shore, flaming arrows streaking through dusk. This was rare. Wood was precious. Ships even more so. But when it happened, it was unforgettable. Picture it, a longship adrift at twilight, flames blooming along the sail, the fire climbing up the mast like a serpent of light, the distant chanting, the smell of pitch and pine, and the sea, dark and endless, swallowing everything but the fire's reflection. That reflection would be remembered for lifetimes. To the Norse, it was a message. To the gods, to the community, to the enemies watching from afar. It said, "This man lived well, he died well, and now he travels well." That is what the ritual of fire and flesh accomplished. It was not about disposal, it was about transition, transformation, continuity. It was belief made visible, terrible, beautiful, and absolute. In the Viking world, death was not a solitary event. It was a procession that demanded witnesses, ritual, and often, blood. To the Norse mind, a soul did not travel alone. Just as a living man was surrounded by servants, warriors, and animals, so too would he require companions in the afterlife. This belief gave rise to one of the most haunting features of the Viking death ship, the practice of human and animal sacrifice. The cost of passage was steep, and the price was paid in flesh. The scale of sacrifice varied with status. A farmer might be buried with a few tokens and perhaps a dog, but a powerful chieftain, a sea king, or a vulva could command a cortege of the slain. The ship was not merely a coffin, it was an entourage. The most vivid description of this practice comes again from the 10th century Arab envoy, Ahmad ibn Fadlan, whose account of a Norse funeral along the Volga is unmatched in its detail. He watched in astonishment as slaves were killed, animals slaughtered, and a girl selected to accompany her dead master was, intoxicated, ceremonially raped, then stabbed to death as part of the funeral rite. To modern eyes, it is a spectacle of horror, but to the Norse, it was sacred. This girl was not forced in the conventional sense. According to Ibn Fadlan, she volunteered. She believed she would rejoin her master in the afterlife, serving him in the next world as she had in this one. Whether driven by faith, coercion, or ritual pressure, her sacrifice was treated as an honored act. The priestess known in Ibn Fadlan's account as the Angel of Death oversaw the process. She guided the girl through her final hours, clothed her in fine garments, led her in song, and then orchestrated the killing. 6 men gripped her limbs. The priestess plunged the knife beneath her ribs. Her death was not random. It was ceremonial. In this rite, every action had symbolic weight. The rope was not just a tool, it represented the severing of life from the earthly plane. The dagger, often carved with runes, symbolized the key to the next world. The blood was not spilt, it was offered. Animals, too, paid the price. Excavations of ship burials have revealed entire ecosystems of the afterlife. Horses, cattle, dogs, and falcons were laid alongside the dead. At Gokstad, 12 horses were found buried around the ship. At Oseberg, oxen, dogs, and even a cart pulled by sacrificed horses were discovered. These were not offerings in the passive sense. They were gifts meant to serve or symbolize the status of the deceased. Each animal was killed with care. Throats slit, skulls crushed, necks broken. The blood may have been collected for use in ritual. In some cases, the heads were removed and arranged beside the body, a visual declaration of power, wealth, and the authority to command life and death. The horse held special significance. In Norse belief, it was not only a symbol of nobility, but a psychopompa creature that carried souls between worlds. The god Odin himself rode Sleipnir, an 8-legged horse that could traverse the realms of the living and the dead. To be buried with a horse was to ensure swift travel. To be buried with 12 was to proclaim kingship beyond the grave. Dogs were also common in Viking graves. Faithful in life, they were believed to guard or guide their masters in death. Some may have represented Garma, the monstrous hound of hell, who stood at the gates of the underworld. Others were simply companions loyal unto death. In some rare burials, birds were found. Falcons, especially, signified nobility and divine connection. Their presence suggests that even in death, the elite wished to communicate with the sky god saw to be seen as elevated, soaring above the earthly realm. What made these sacrifices so impactful then and now was their integration into a cohesive belief system. The Norse did not kill for spectacle alone. They killed to fulfill cosmic obligations. The dead had needs. The dead had journeys. To deny them their servants, their horses, their weapons, would be to invite misfortune both for the soul and for the community. Even tools and objects were sometimes killed. Swords were bent, spears snapped, shields cracked. These were not accidents. The Vikings ritually destroyed items to release their spirits, allowing them to follow their owners. In this way, the ship became not just a tomb, but a sealed universe, complete with all the elements required for rebirth on the other side. It was also a declaration to the living. When a neighboring clan saw smoke on the horizon and heard the keening chants, they did not only mark the death of a man, they witnessed the ascension of a legacy. They saw how many had been sacrificed. How many horses? How many thralls? How much wealth was consigned to flame or earth? It was a display of power. The dead man's greatness was made tangible by the price others paid to join him. And to enemies, the implication was chilling. If this is how they treat their dead, what will they do to us? The Viking death ship was not merely a vehicle for one man's soul. It was a procession of status, an orchestration of blood, a sacred drama played out before gods and men. Fire was the end, but sacrifice was the door. And for the Norse, it was a door worth walking through. In the Viking world, a world dominated in legend by axe-swinging warriors and warlords cloaked in chainmail, there existed another kind of power, a quieter, stranger, and perhaps even more feared force. It did not carry swords, but staffs. It did not ride into battle, but stood at the edge of it, murmuring to the unseen. These were the Valurth women who guided the dead. Without them, the Viking death ship could not sail. To understand the death ship's full meaning, we must understand the ritual leadership behind it. At the center of Viking funerals especially, those involving great men or high-ranking women, stood a female spiritual figure whose role was both practical and metaphysical. She was called the Volva, plural volya, the staff carrier, the wand woman, a seeress, a guide, a priestess, and sometimes a feared sorceress. The Volva was not a priest in the Christian sense. She was not affiliated with a temple or dogma. She stood between worlds, serving as an intermediary between the living and the dead, the seen and the unseen. She could bless, she could curse, and at funerals, she performed the rites that ensured the dead would pass safely into the next realm. She also orchestrated the sacrifices. In the most detailed account, we have Ahmad ibn Fadlan's record of a Norse funeral on the Volgaith woman who performed the death rites is called the Angel of Death. She was no passive mourner, she was central to the ritual. It was she who prepared the sacrificial girl, who led the songs, who handed her the mead, who comforted her and then killed her. Her dagger, sharpened and deliberate, opened the path to the afterlife. Her chants summoned the gods. Her hand closed the circle. Though Ibn Fadlan does not call her a Volva by name, her role mirrors what Norse sagas and archaeology suggest about these women. They were mysterious, powerful, and deeply respected, even feared. Some travelled between communities, performing rites for those who could pay or who needed divine insight. Others were attached to chieftains' households, serving as ritual advisors, healers, and spiritual anchors. What did they wear? How did they look? Archaeological finds provide haunting clues. One of the most famous graves of a Volva was unearthed in Oseberg, Norway, the same monumental burial that held two high-status women aboard a fully constructed ship. Among the grave goods was a staff or wand, iron-tipped and twisted like a serpent. Such staffs are commonly found in female graves across Scandinavia and are believed to be emblems of magical or prophetic authority. These women often wore cloaks of rich animal fur, jewelry with mystical motifs, and pendants shaped like hammers or ravens. Some wore necklaces strung with beads of glass and amber, or even fragments of Roman and Byzantine coin subjects of prestige and power. Their graves sometimes contained hemlock, henbane, or other hallucinogenic plants, suggesting the use of trance or altered states during rituals. The vulva's power came not from battle, but from vision. She was believed to see the future, interpret omens, commune with spirits, and traverse the layers of the Norse cosmos. In the saga of Eric the Red, a seeress named Thorbjorg is summoned to help a famine-struck settlement. She is greeted with reverence, offered a special seat, fed sacred food, and honored with song before she delivers her prophecy. Her presence brings hope and fear. At funerals, this fear deepened, because the vulva did not just guide the soul, she commanded the spirits. She ensured that the dead did not linger, did not haunt, did not return as restless corpses who could walk the land, bringing disease, madness, or ruin. Her chants sealed the grave. Her staff protected the living. Her knowledge, often hereditary and secret, ensured the ritual was complete. In this way, the vulva made the death ship sacred. She oversaw the laying of the body in the hull. She approved the arrangement of grave goods. She gave final instructions to the mourners. And in the most elaborate rites, she orchestrated the threshold moment, that terrible, holy instant when the flame was lit, the ship was sent adrift, or the mound was sealed. Her song might be the last sound the community heard before silence fell. Even Christian converts in later centuries remembered the Volo with reverence. Saga writers, often skeptical of pagan beliefs, still wrote of these women with awe. They were not to be mocked. To forget the rituals, to disrespect the seeress, was to invite disaster in this world and the next. Consider the broader context. In a culture where death was transition, where ships carried souls between worlds, the vulva was the navigator. She read the wind of the other world. She set the course. Without her, the ship could not sail, not in body and not in spirit. That is why her presence mattered so profoundly. Because the death ship was not merely a ceremony of fire and wood, it was a dialogue with the divine. And in that dialogue, the most powerful voice belonged to a woman draped in fur, holding a crooked staff and singing to the dead. Not all Viking death ships were lost to flame and wave. Some were preserved by time itself, buried beneath earth and stone, sealed in soil thick with ritual and silence. Among the most extraordinary of these are the Oseberg and Gokstad ships, royal tombs that still speak across 1,000 years, whispering of a culture where death was both ceremony and spectacle. These ships were not ordinary vessels, they were monuments. The Norse did not raise stone pyramids or towering mausoleums. They raised ships, then lowered them into the earth. The Oseberg ship, discovered in 1904 in a burial mound near Tønsberg, Norway, is perhaps the most exquisite Viking ship ever found. It dates to around 834 CE and is a masterwork of shipbuilding and artistry, 72 feet long, carved from oak, with 15 oar holes on each side and an elegantly curved prow that rises like a serpent's neck. But it was what the ship contained that transformed it from artifact into revelation. Inside lay the bodies of 2 women aged, likely in her 70s, and one younger, around 50. Their identities remain debated. Were they a queen and her handmaiden, a priestess and her acolyte, or both powerful in their own right? What is clear is that this was no ordinary burial. The older woman had a disfigured spine, perhaps from illness or injury, but she was buried with grandeur. Her hair was still visible, carefully arranged. The grave goods around them were staggering. A 4-wheeled cart, carved with intertwining animal motifs, 3 intricately decorated sleds, a bed, agricultural tools, wooden chests filled with textiles, animal remains, 15 horses, 4 dogs, and 2 oxen sacrificed and laid around the ship. Buckets, cooking gear, tapestry, savory detail arranged with care, as if these women were to set sail at dawn. And then there was the staffa bent wand of iron, snake-shaped and twisted, likely belonging to a vulva. Its presence suggests that one of these women was a seeress, a spiritual figure of enormous importance. Perhaps the burial was not just royal, but ritualistic, a funeral not only of status, but of sacred function. The mound that held the Oseberg ship was sealed with turf and clay, creating the anaerobic conditions that preserved the wood and many of the contents. And so, centuries later, The funeral speaks again of gender, power, ritual, and the central place of ships in the Norse imagination. Then there is the Gokstad ship, uncovered in 1880 in a burial mound near Sandefjord, Norway, just 40 kilometers from Oseberg. Dating to around 900 CE, it is broader and more robust than the Oseberg vessel designed for speed and stability at sea. Unlike Oseberg's elegant curves, Gokstad is a warship, 76 feet long, built for battle and distance, with 16 oar holes per side. Its purpose in death was no less profound. Inside the Gokstad mound lay the skeleton of a man, aged around 40, tall, and powerfully built. His bones showed signs of battle trauma slashes to the leg, a possible blow to the skull. He was buried with weapons, though many had been looted in earlier centuries. Fragments of armor remained. Around him, the remains of 12 horses, 6 dogs, and 2 peacocks. Yes, peacocks, an exotic import from distant lands, likely brought through trade routes reaching as far as Byzantium. This man was no minor chieftain. He was a sea king, a war leader, a traveler who had seen the edges of the known world and returned with silver, silk, and blood on his blade. The Gokstad burial, like Oseberg's, was an act of storytelling. Every detail said, this man mattered. In life and in death, he sailed for Rand. He sails still. These tombs were more than graves. They were ritual landscapes, built with a cosmic logic. The ship itself represented the vessel of transition. The grave goods formed the provisions for the journey. The mounded earth was not just cover, it was a second sea, a symbolic horizon beneath which the ship could continue its voyage. It's likely that these funerals were public events, attended by entire communities. Rituals would have unfolded over day song, feasting, sacrifice. Skalds might have recited the lineage of the dead. Seeresses would have conducted rites to secure the soul's passage. Weapons were killed, bent, or broken before burial. Animals were slain and arranged in patterns still visible today. And then the mound was raised. Heavy turf laid over the ship, stone packed tight. In time, the site would appear as a small hill, nothing more. But beneath that green skin lay an entire cosmology in wood and bone. To Christian Europe, these mounds were an affront, pagan relics of a defiant, death-worshipping people. But to the Norse, they were vessels of eternity. The Oseberg and Gokstad ships endure today not just as artifacts, but as revelations. They prove what the sagas claimed, that the ship was sacred, that the dead were honoured not with tombstones, but with keels and masts, that even in the grave, the Norse imagined motion, not stillness. These ships never sailed again, at least not across water. But in their stillness, they travel still, carrying the memory of a people who believed that the best way to die was to sail, and that the best way to be remembered was to be buried like a storm. To the untrained eye, a Viking longship might appear as a marvel of engineering, a finely crafted machine of war or exploration. But to the Norse, it was much more. When repurposed for death, it became not only a vessel of passage, but a sacred altar, a place of offering, of transformation, and of divine convergence. The ship was not just built, it was consecrated. Every part of its structure, the wood, the nails, the sail, the very keel held meaning. It was not enough that it floated, it had to resonate. The act of constructing a death ship was itself a spiritual exercise. The materials were chosen not only for strength, but for symbolism. The wood came first. Oak was preferred, dense, durable, and sacred. In Norse myth, oak was the tree of Thor, a protector against lightning and chaos. A great oak felled for a death ship would have been a significant act, undertaken with reverence. Trees were not simply resources, they were ancient beings, embodiments of life and rooted memory. To cut one was to engage in dialogue with the forest spirits. The tree was often seasoned, left to dry, and strengthen over several winters before being shaped into the ship's spine and ribs. The keel, carved from a single piece of oak, formed the backbone of the vessel and symbolized the integrity of the soul's journey. If the keel cracked, the voyage was cursed. Iron bound the ship together, but it was never mundane. The rivets and nails used in construction were forged by blacksmiths who, in Norse society, held semi-mystical status. Smithing was considered a magical act. The transformation of raw ore into shining metal was akin to alchemy. In some sagas, blacksmiths are depicted as wise men, even seers. The forging of a death ship's iron may have involved invocations, rune carving, or chants to imbue it with spiritual resilience. In several ship burials, iron nails were bent before burial, a gesture of release. Just as weapons were killed to serve in the afterlife, so too were the ship's fasteners. Once the journey began, the ship would never sail this world again. Runes were sometimes carved into the ship's timbers. These were not decorations, they were spells. The younger Futhark, the Norse rune alphabet, held symbolic and magical significance. Runes for protection, for strength, for a safe journey might be incised along the inner hull, hidden beneath the grave goods, or painted onto shields affixed to the sides of the ship. A few runic inscriptions invoke Thor or Odin directly, asking for safe passage or divine recognition. Then came the sail woven by women over long, dark winters, often from fine wool, treated with animal fat and ochre to repel water and hold wind. The sail was not merely fabric, it was the spirit of the ship, catching the unseen breath of the gods. For funerals, a special sail might be raised brightly coloured, embroidered, or dyed with sacred patterns. Its final unfurling was like a shroud lifted to the sky. On board, the layout of the grave goods mirrored the ship's sanctity. The body was placed amidships the spiritual heart. Around it, items were arranged with ritual logic. Sword on the dominant side, drinking horn near the head, animals at the bow and stern. Each object had its role. Nothing was random. The ship became a stage of transcendence, a floating temple. In many cases, ritual libations were poured across the hull. Mead, blood, oil, even seawater blessed by a vulva. The liquid soaked into the wood, binding the ship to both the sea and the divine. In some traditions, small sacrificial fires were lit on board before the full blaze, their smoke intended to attract the attention of gods or ancestors. The very shape of the ship was cosmological, long, narrow, and symmetrical. It mimicked the cosmic serpent, Jörmungandr, who encircled the world. It also mirrored Naglfar's ship, made from dead men's nails, which, according to myth, would carry the forces of chaos during Ragnarok. The ship in death thus became a symbol of liminality, of thresholds, edges, crossings, and at its helm the carved figurehead. Often a dragon, serpent, or wolf, it was both protector and guide. These were not mere symbols of terror, but totemic guardians, invoked to guide the soul through the perils of the underworld. Some heads were removable and taken down before entering friendly harbours, suggesting they were not only decorative, but magically active. Once prepared, the ship stood in silence wood, iron, and wool, becoming altar, ark, and effigy all at once. And when the torch was touched to the pitch-lined timbers, the sanctified vessel became the medium by which a soul was lifted from earth to sky, or sea to spirit. The crackling of fire was not destruction, it was ascension. To the Christian monks who saw such ships burn off distant coasts, they were blasphemies, wild, pagan errors, but they misunderstood. These were not rejections of death's finality. They were affirmations that death was not final at all. The ship was the sacred boundary between the world of men and the world of gods, and those who passed through it left behind more than ash. To the Norse, the death ship was a gateway, but to their neighbour stow, the Christian kingdoms of medieval Europe, it was an omen, a spectacle, a nightmare made real. In the abbeys and courts from Francia to Northumbria, the Viking longship was already an object of dread. But when that longship was seen not as a raiding vessel, but as a floating pyre, it became something more unsettling still, a glimpse into a cosmology that defied Christian order. Where the cross preached humility, the longship burned in arrogance. Where Christian graves were quiet, Viking funerals howled with blood and fire. And so, when death ships appeared washed ashore, reported by travellers, or chronicled by trembling scribes, they did more than stir fear. They fractured world views. Consider the scriptorium at the Abbey of Saint-Benoît-sur-Loire. In the year 853, a monk recorded in uneven Latin the aftermath of a Viking raid on the coastal town of Noirmoutier. The bodies of slain monks were discovered, mutilated, the chapel defiled. But what unnerved the survivors most was what the Northmen had left behind: a blackened ship, beached and still smouldering, with the remains of one of their own burned in state, surrounded by the remains of horses and weapons. They had not just killed, they had celebrated. The fire had been their hymn, the ship, their altar. To the monks, this was sacrilege beyond reckoning. Death was to be humble, orderly, entombed beneath stone. The soul was to rise in silence, in prayer. But here were pagans who embraced the grave with laughter and flame, who sent their dead not downward, but upward with iron and ash and joy. In the Carolingian courts of Francia, reports of such funerals were even more unsettling. Emperors and bishops read intelligence from their coastal abbots. The Northmen burned one of their own. They sacrificed animals. They sang strange songs. The fire lit the sea. What were they to make of this? In the worldview of Christendom, rituals outside the church were inherently suspect if not outright demonic. Sacrifice, in particular, was abhorrent. To slit the throat of a thrall, to burn a ship in offering, to call upon gods with no names in Latin, this was devil's work. The book of Leviticus had long forbidden burnt offerings outside of divine law, and here were barbarians violating every such rule with fire and joy. To royal minds, the symbolism was potent. These funerals weren't only personnel, they were political theatre. A dead Viking laid in a ship with gold and slain horses sent a message: "We honour our dead more richly than you honour your kings." Indeed, some of these spectacles may have been deliberate acts of psychological warfare. A Viking crew landing, lighting a funeral pyre, and sending the smoke toward a nearby Christian village was making more than a spiritual statement. It was a warning. You build cathedrals, we build gods from flame. Not all European accounts viewed Viking funerals with horror. Some viewed them with curiosity and awe. In the court of the Byzantine Emperor Theophilos, Varangian Guards Norse mercenaries in imperial service were allowed to perform abbreviated death rites for fallen comrades. Their fire was constrained, their sacrifices censored, but the ship remained central. Even under the gaze of orthodoxy, the ship was allowed to carry its warrior, not for theology, but for tradition. Arab chroniclers, like Ibn Fadlan, walked a fine line between revulsion and fascination. His detailed account, likely written for a court audience, described the rituals of the Rus's Scandinavian traders along the Volga with both precision and horror. He called their practices abominable and primitive, but he did not deny their order and beauty. The precision of the sacrifice, the rhythm of the chants, the dignity of the ships burning, these details haunted him. What terrified Christian and Islamic chroniclers alike was not just the violence of the Vikings, but their embrace of death. To die was not a failure. To burn was not shame. It was triumph. These were not souls lost to darkness, they were claimed by fire. And so the death ship, drifting on foreign seas or buried beneath foreign hills, became a symbol of cultural defiance. The Norse did not fear hell. They did not crave salvation. They lit their way with flame, not grace. Imagine a coastal monastery in Ireland, year 890. The monks see smoke on the northern horizon. Not a fleet, just one ship, set aflame. They gather on the cliffside. They chant prayers against the coming terror. One young novice dares to whisper, "Is it a funeral or a warning?" He is not wrong, because to those watching from across the boundaries of faith and geography, the Viking death ship was not only a mystery, it was a manifestation of something Europe had forgotten, a culture that did not ask permission to die well. In death, as in life, the Norse stood at a crossroads, between earth and water, between silence and song, between the Christian world, which buried its faithful beneath stone and scripture, and their own world, which embraced flame, wind, and salt. For the Vikings, how a person was laid to rest spoke volumes not just about status or wealth, but about belief. The decision between sea burial and earth burial was not a matter of geography alone, it was a cultural statement, a reflection of cosmology, of ritual, and of the soul's imagined journey beyond this life. In Christian Europe, death was an end, followed by resurrection. The body was buried in consecrated ground, usually within reach of a church, its grave marked by a stone cross. The soul awaited judgment. Silence, humility, and decay were signs of spiritual submission. The grave was still. But the Norse? Their graves moved. Whether set ablaze and pushed into the waves, or entombed beneath mounds shaped like ships, Viking funerals spoke of motion, the soul sailing from one world to the next. For them, death was not sleep. It was departure. Two dominant modes of burial shaped Viking ritual: sea burials and ship burials on land. The sea burial, often the most dramatic, was reserved for the bold, the rich, or the mythic. A longship or small vessel was prepared, the body laid aboard, surrounded by weapons, food, and tokens of life. Sometimes the ship was set ablaze before being launched. Sometimes it drifted unlit into the horizon. Always, it was a farewell writ in wind and fire. The goal was not to destroy, but to liberate. The fire consumed the flesh and the wood, transforming the vessel into smoke and ash elements that could ascend to the sky gods. The sea, vast and unknowable, served as the boundary between this world and the next. A soul carried by flame and tide would not be forgotten. It would be spoken of. Yet sea burials were rare. Wood was precious, and conditions had to be perfect. More commonly, the Vikings turned to earth burials, where ships were laid in trenches, covered with goods and bodies, and then buried beneath mounds. These were not compromises. They were cosmological replications. The ship still sailed, but now through the soil, into the deep realm of hell, or toward Valhalla, or wherever fate and the gods deemed. Mounds themselves were designed to echo the ship's shape. The sides rose in arcs. The prow and stern became the entrance and exit to the underworld. Many mounds were aligned with solar or lunar events, suggesting not just a reverence for cycles, but a belief that death itself followed a celestial rhythm. Some earth burials were symbolic. In regions with few ships, stones were laid in ship-like outlines. The dead were buried within the shape, surrounded by weapons, bones, and sometimes standing stones. These stone ships, found across Scandinavia and the Baltic, were still ritual vessels, even if they never touched water. Christian missionaries and chroniclers were appalled by both forms. They saw burning ships as wasteful and pagan. They saw mounds as prideful, lacking humility. But what they misunderstood was this. For the Norse, a ship was not vanity, it was vocation. A vessel that had carried a warrior across oceans must now carry him to the next. The ship was not buried out of ritual fancy, it was buried because it was part of the man. The burial modes also reflected belief in where the soul would go. For those dying of sickness or age, a land burial was more likely. Their soul might descend to Helheim, the misty underworld beneath the roots of Yggdrasil, ruled by the goddess Hel. Not a place of torment, just a cold, distant realm of shadows. Their grave would be packed with food, tools, perhaps a pet, a quiet voyage. But for the fallen warrior, the berserker slain in battle, the sea king struck down mid-rider, more dramatic passage was required. These were candidates for sea burials, cremations, or mound ships heavy with the weight of sacrificed animals and shattered swords. Their destination was Valhalla, or Folkvanga, where Odin or Freyja awaited the worthy. Their ship had to reflect their life's violence and valor. By the 10th and 11th centuries, as Christianity spread deeper into Scandinavia, these traditions clashed. Burial mounds gave way to graveyards. Ship burials declined. Fire was replaced by consecrated soil. Yet even then, hints of the old ways remained. A sword buried beneath the church floor, a grave aligned toward the setting sun, a stone ship hidden behind a chapel. The cultural crossroads had been reached, but the old road was not forgotten. Even today, the difference is stark. The Christian grave faces the sky, asking for resurrection. The Viking ship burial faces the horizon, promising a journey. One pleads for salvation. The other dares to sail on. Not every Norse soul was granted the honor of a ship. The Viking death ship was a privilege, a final reward, not a right. To be laid in a vessel of oak and iron, surrounded by goods and fire, was to be recognized as extraordinary in life. The question was not simply how one died, but who one had been. In the Viking world, social status was a force stronger than the tides. From birth, a man or woman's place in society was shaped by lineage, wealth, deeds, and influence. And in death, that place was reflected with clarity. The death ship was not democratic. It was hierarchical theatre, played upon a stage of ritual, blood, and legacy. Who, then, was deemed worthy of such a ship? At the top of the funeral hierarchy were the Jarls, the noble warrior elite, who commanded men, land, and ships in life. These men were sea kings, leaders of raids and trade expeditions, sons of dynasties stretching across fjords and islands. When a Jarl died, his body was not merely buried, it was celebrated. His ship might be pulled onto a hill, its hull lined with treasure and sacrifice, the mound above it crowned with a stone marking his name and deeds. A Jarl's funeral was a statement of continuity. His death was not the end of a reign, but the preservation of prestige. His kin would be expected to match the spectacle. To do less was to risk dishonoring the name. and so his ship became a monument to lineage. Just beneath the jarls were the Herseers, local war leaders and chieftains, often loyal to more powerful lords but with autonomy in their own regions. A successful Herser might receive a smaller ship burial, perhaps with fewer sacrifices, but still marked by weapons, livestock, and ritual. And then there were the warriors of renowned berserkers, champions and raiders, whose fame exceeded their rank. A man who slew many in battle, returned with spoils, and earned the songs of skalds might be granted a ship burial by popular will or by the generosity of his kin. These funerals were sometimes spontaneous, arranged by comrades who had fought beside him and lived to carry him home. But it wasn't only men. Certain women, particularly those with spiritual power or matriarchal status, were granted ship burials of immense grandeur. The Oseberg burial containing 2 high-ranking women, one likely a Volvace proof of this. Their funeral ship was not lesser than a warlord's. It was, in some ways, more elaborate, filled with sacred objects, carved wagons, and animal offerings. These women may have been priestesses, queens, or both. In Viking society, women held unique positions in death-related rites. A Volva's body might be buried with her staff, her herb pouch, and her Cirrus's garments gifts to continue her craft in the afterlife. Her ship, like that of the warriors, was a tool for transcendence. Below this elite tier were the freeman farmers, craftsmen, traders, sailors. These men, while respected, were seldom buried in ships unless they had achieved something exceptional. Most were cremated or buried in simpler graves, sometimes with weapons or personal items, but without the grandeur of a full ship. For them, a symbolic stone ship might be arranged a gesture of belief, even if the body lay in the soil. Thrall slaves occupied the lowest rung. They did not receive ships, but paradoxically, some thralls were buried in themas, part of someone else's ritual. In the case of elite burials, especially those involving human sacrifice, thralls were killed and placed beside their masters to accompany them into death. These were not honors, but obligations, a tragic echo of their service in life. What determined who got a ship? It was not only wealth, but reputation. A jarl who ruled in peace might be less celebrated than a warrior who died with blood on his blade. The sagas often celebrate the fallen more than the rulers. The death ship, then, became a reflection not just of status, but of story. If your name was sung around the hearths of winter, if your sword had bitten Frankish mail or Saxon bone, if your hands had guided a ship through storm and war, then the ship was your destiny even in death. But the resources mattered. A ship burial was a costly ritual. It required land, trees, iron, livestock, and labor. For this reason, many Vikings planned for their death as carefully as their lives. A chieftain might begin preparing his burial long before his final battle, stockpiling goods, instructing his kin, selecting the ship. The funeral was a final conquest, one that must be won. These choices echoed outward. To the living, a death ship was not just for the dead, it was a lesson. Children saw the fire and understood, greatness is remembered. Warriors saw the burial mound and knew, valor is rewarded. Enemies saw the smoke and feared, this man had followers who loved him enough to burn a ship. In Viking society, death did not erase hierarchy, it confirmed it. To sail in death was to have sailed well in life. And the ship was not just a coffin, it was a final stage, a silhouette of memory set against the sea. Before the fire, before the chanting, before the ship was pulled into its final resting place, there was silence. A long, heavy silence that blanketed the Norse world like mist on the fjords. This was the pre-burial vigil, sacred pause between life and death, between the warrior's last breath and his departure into myth. It was not an idle waiting. For the Vikings, the hours or days following death were not yet final. The soul hovered. The body remained bound to the world of the living. And so, the vigil became a moment of tension, a liminal threshold, where time felt stretched, suspended, sacred. The longhouse would be dim, the hearth fire low. The body of the deceased was washed and dressed, often by family or chosen kin. His hair might be combed, his beard oiled, his body arranged with care, not unlike a noble prepared for battle. If he had died far from home, his companions might place him upon a shield and carry him back by cart or ship, singing as they travelled. If he had died at home, his community gathered quickly. The vigil began. This was not a solitary affair. The dead were not left alone. they were watched guarded. In some traditions, two figures stood beside the body day and night, armed and silent, to prevent evil spirits or wandering draugr, restless dead, from approaching. Others believed that the soul could not rest until the funeral rites had begun, that it lingered, confused, perhaps even resentful. And so, offerings were made, songs were sung, incense was burned. There was often weeping, but not despair. Tears were expected, but so were tales. Skalds, the poets of the north, would gather to recite the deeds of the fallen, his victories in battle, his children, the time he slew a bear with one hand, the night he drank 12 horns of mead and still won the wrestling match. His life was reborn in words, each story an offering to memory. This was how the Norse mourned, not with elegy, but with saga. Sometimes, objects were brought to the body, his sword, his drinking horn, tokens from past raids, fragments of ships he had sailed. Each item laid beside him was a chapter in his tale. These were not merely possessions, they were anchors for the soul's journey, reminders of who he had been and why the gods would recognize his name. The presence of a Volva or Sethkona woman, skilled in prophecy or ritual, was especially important during this time. She might read omens in firelight, perform chants, or commune with spirits to determine the most favorable time for the funeral. Some believe she helped untie the soul from the body, loosening it like a mooring rope from a dock. If the burial would involve a ship either for burning or interment, preparations began during the vigil. The vessel was drawn onto land, its deck swept clean. The prow might be decorated with new carvings or draped in cloth dyed with ochre or blood. Men sharpened axes and daggers not for war, but for ritual. Horses were prepared. In some cases, a slave or concubine was chosen. Her fate was sealed during these hours. As the final night approached, the ritual meals began. Feasting was not uncommon, not gluttonous indulgence, but communal remembrance. Mead passed from hand to hand. Dried fish, bread, and stewed meat were shared. Guests spoke the names of the dead aloud over and over to ensure they were not forgotten. Each name, each toast, each bite of food was both an offering to the soul and a bonding of the living. But beneath it all, there was still the silent seer sense of looming transformation. Even the fiercest warriors grew still during the vigil. The clatter of armor gave way to the hush of firelight. The heavy presence of death reminded all who gathered that they, too, would one day be watched, wept for, and remembered. The vigil was not only for the dead, it was practice for the living. And as dawn broke, a decision was made. If it was a ship cremation, the body was carried to the vessel and placed in its center, surrounded by his weapons, animals, and companions in death. If it was an earth burial, the ship had already been settled into its trench, waiting for its final occupant. The torch was lit. The crowd gathered. One last prayer, one last chant, one last story. And then the silence shattered by flame, by weeping, by song. But for that final night, for those sacred hours before the fire came, the Viking world held its breath. The Viking death ship was never just for the dead, it was for the living, for the mourners who stood in awe at the prow, for the enemies who watched the smoke curl over the horizon, for the gods who, it was hoped, would see the blaze and open the gates of the afterlife. In a culture where memory was immortal and fire was a language, the death ship became more than a burial, it became a message written in ash and wind. To send a warrior off in a ship was to tell the world that this man mattered, that his life had weight, that his name had echoes. But when that ship was set ablaze, when fire kissed, sail and soul alike, it became a performance. A theatrical declaration that death had not conquered him, that his voyage continued, that even in lifelessness he moved. To friends it inspired loyalty, to rivals it stoked envy, and to enemies it terrified. Imagine the coastline of early medieval Ireland. A fisherman rises before dawn and sees a glow upon the shore, not sunrise but flame. A Viking longship, aflame and empty of oars, glides slowly in with the current. He watches from behind a dune as the burning hull kisses the shore, its frame creaking, its mast collapsing in sparks. There is no one aboard but the dead, but the message is clear. We are not afraid of death. We glorify it. We have mastered it. In this way, the Viking funeral became a form of psychological warfare. The longship was already a weapon and image of swift violence, of raids and plunder, but when used in death, it became something worse, a symbol that the Viking threat did not end with the grave. If this is how they treat their fallen, what reverence or revenge might they show to their slain enemies? Monks recorded such events in tones of dread. In the Annals of Ulster, one entry mentions a Norse funeral on a riverbank near Armagh, a great fire, seen even at night, and pagan men singing in their tongue, offering to their dead one a boat of blood and song. Even if embellished, the account reflects the emotional impact such funerals had. Viking death ships could also function as political tools. A jarl who wished to show dominance might commission a death ship funeral for his father or for himself, in preparation so elaborate that it rivaled a king's coronation. It was not uncommon for funerals to be observed by rival clans, emissaries, or even foreign travellers. These were not private affairs. They were statements. The ship's decoration was part of the display. Its sail might bear the family's sigil. The figurehead dragon, boar, serpent, was often newly carved, painted, perhaps even adorned with silver or bone. The layout of the funeral was not random. The timing mattered. Some burials were done at the solstice, others under a full moon. These choices were not just spiritual, they were symbolic gestures of power. And when fire was used, it was as much about visibility as ritual. Flames could be seen for miles. At night, a ship ablaze on water was a floating pirate's silhouette burned into memory. It could be interpreted as a sign of mourning, yes, but also as a warning. We honor our own. We do not forget. We do not forgive. This spectacle had staying power. Long after the Vikings faded from Europe's frontiers, the imagery of the death ship lingered. In the folklore of Scotland, tales persisted of burning ships sailing silently across the sea-ghostly omens. In parts of Normandy, stories were told of barrows filled with gold and ships buried beneath ancient hills. These were not just stories of treasure, they were stories of fear and fascination. Even today, the sight of a Viking longship on film, in museums, carved into stone evokes not just awe, but a kind of primal reaction. The shape is sleek, dangerous, its history soaked in fire. And somewhere deep in the cultural memory of Europe, the message of the death ship remains. We do not vanish, we voyage. When a Viking died, especially one of stature, their ship was not sent into the afterlife empty. It was filled, meticulously, with the tools, treasures, and tokens of their earthly life. These were more than mementos. They were grave goods, offerings for the journey, declarations of identity, and symbols of enduring power. For the Norse, the afterlife was not a place of disembodied spirits drifting through clouds. It was real, tangible. A continuation of the world they knew, full of feasting halls, weapons, mead, and honor. To travel unarmed or ill-equipped into that world would be unthinkable. And so, the sea kings, the jarls, warriors, and captains of the Viking world were buried with the finest that life had given them. The variety and richness of these grave goods speak volumes about what the Norse valued, both in life and beyond. First and foremost were the weapons. Swords, spears, axes, bows, and shields were almost always present. Not simple ones, but elaborately crafted instruments of war, often personalized, sometimes named. A warrior's sword might be inlaid with silver, its hilt wrapped in patterned wire, the blade etched with runes. These weapons were not just tools, they were extensions of the self. In death, the blades were often killed before burial, bent or broken to release their spirit and ensure it could travel with its master. Armor and helms might be included too, though less commonly, as iron was precious. The famous Geirmundbu helmet, one of the few Viking-era helmets ever recovered, suggests that such items were deeply symbolic, marking a man's martial status even in the grave. Animals were frequent companions in burial. Horses were among the most prized. At Gokstad, a dozen horses were found buried with the ship's occupant, perhaps his personal steeds, perhaps sacrificial gifts meant to carry him to the other world. Dogs, falcons, and even peacocks were also included, each representing companionship, nobility, or exotic prestige. Beyond war and beasts, there were objects of wealth and identity, chests filled with silver coins, necklaces of amber or glass beads, brooches cast in intricate bronze, and rings forged in gold. These items not only declared the dead man's wealth, they served as currency for the next world. In Norse belief, the afterlife demanded tribute. Better to arrive with full coffers. More personal items often joined them: drinking horns, carved combs, game boards with bone-playing pieces, musical instruments, cooking pots, ladles, cauldrons. These were not frivolities. They were the intimate tools of daily life. They suggested that the dead would live again and that he would need these comforts to do so. Among the most haunting finds in elite burials are carts and sleds. The Oseberg ship contained a richly carved wooden cart, wheels etched with serpents and interlaced beasts. Sleds for winter travel were also placed beside the dead, indicating that movement journeying was central to the Norse vision of life after death. The dead were not buried to rest, they were buried to go on. Some burials included ritual tools, staffs, wands, or bowls used in seether. Magic. These were especially common in graves, believed to belong to Vola female seeresses and ritual leaders. The inclusion of these items suggests a continuity of power, that these women would retain their spiritual role even beyond death. In a few rare cases, mushrooms and herbs have been found possibly psychoactive. If so, they may have played a role in visions, or in the rituals surrounding death, helping to guide the soul or seer into the next world. The grave goods also varied by region and exposure to trade. Vikings who had travelled to the east, particularly through the rivers of what is now Russia and Ukraine, often carried Byzantine silks, Arabic coins, or Persian glassware. Those who raided in Britain or Francia might bring home Christian crosses, sometimes buried alongside pagan icons, showing a strange fusion or domination of one belief system over another. Each object laid in the ship was a chapter, a declaration, a kind of biography told in bone, bronze, and blood. To the Vikings, the act of burial was not merely about mourning, it was about honouring. The more goods a man took with him, the more visible his power. His ship was not just a vessel, it was a mobile monument, a ship of memory, packed with symbols, designed to impress both gods and men. Even now, when archaeologists uncover these graves, they read the goods as messages: a sword bent in defiance, a comb smoothed from use, a dog's skeleton curled at the feet of its master. Each piece tells a story not just of who died, but of how the living wanted him to be remembered. Because in Viking thought, death was not the end of your reputation, it was the beginning of your legend. To the monks of Iona, it began with a shimmer, just a thin band of gold along the edge of the sea. Then the smoke rose, thick, black, and slow. The sound came next, not the cries of war or the clash of steel, but the hollow crack of timber splitting beneath flame. It was not a raid, it was not a fleet, it was a funeraler, something like it. And it terrified them more than swords ever could. In the windswept western Isles of Scotland, where Gaelic kings and Norse warbands battled for centuries, the Viking death ship became a weapon of fear. Long before the Christianization of Scandinavia, Norse raiders had pushed deep into the Hebrides, the Orkneys, and beyond. Some came to conquer, others came to settle. But all brought with them the customs of their homeland, especially their relationship with death. In these contested waters, where the line between friend and foe was drawn in tide and stone, the funeral longship was deployed not only as a spiritual ritual, but as psychological warfare. Imagine the scene: a small coastal settlement, a monastery, a Gaelic stronghold, a village clinging to the edge of sky. The locals awake to find a single Viking ship, its hull already burning, drifting slowly toward shore. No crew, no oars. Only a body of severalade out beneath animal hides, surrounded by scorched wood and glinting steel. This was not a fleet come to raid. This was a message. We do not fear death. We give it ceremony. We light it with fire, and we bring it to your doorstep. It was no accident. Historical records, though fragmentary, suggest that such tactics were intentional. The Vikings understood the power of fear, not just in combat, but in symbol. To send a burning ship toward a rival shore was to plant a flag not of conquest, but of cosmic confidence, a declaration that their dead would travel as kings, even in enemy territory. In Norse culture, this was entirely coherent. A man who died far from home still deserved the rights of his ancestors. His body was not to be discarded or buried in foreign soil. It was to be honored with fire, with goods, with ritual, and if that ritual took place near an enemy, even better. It meant that his passage would not go unnoticed. In the Western Isles, where Viking warbands mingled, fought, and sometimes intermarried with local Picts and Gaels, presence of Norse burial ships left a spiritual scar. Even Christianized regions, long after Norse raids had diminished, carried tales of burning ships seen at twilight, of fires on the water that brought bad luck, or the death of chieftains. In some folk traditions, these became omens, ghostly vessels signaling impending war or the rise of a new king. But the use of death ships as tools of terror was not confined to myth. There are accounts some from annals, others preserved in oral tradition that describe Norse funerals held just offshore from enemy-held islands. A burning ship set loose not in the open sea, but within sight of a rival fort. The meaning was unmistakable. We have died here before. We will die here again, and we are not afraid. The tactic was brilliant in its subtlety. Unlike a raid, it required no violence. Unlike a siege, no force. And yet, it conveyed the same message: presence. The Norse were here. They ruled not only the sea, but the threshold between life and death. And even in grief, they displayed dominance. Consider the symbolism. A Christian enemy might bury their dead in silence, in a grave behind stone walls, waiting for resurrection. The Norse would send theirs to sea in flame and song, within view of the same walls. The contrast was not just cultural, it was ideological. Fire became a flag. A drifting corpse in a burning boat became a conqueror's shadow. And even if no sword was raised, the impact could be devastating. For the Western Isles, places like Islay, Mull, and the Outer Hebrides, this strategy left a legacy. Norse graves still dot the coasts. Burial mounds that once held ships now collapsed or looted speak of men buried with reverence, even on foreign shores. And in local legend, the memory of burning ships remains. Not as simple funerals, but as acts of boldness, as ritual declarations of territory. This was not warfare of numbers or tactics. It was theatre of the eternal. Because the Vikings knew that while kingdoms rose and fell, fear endured. And few things could rival the fear evoked by a silent, burning ship gliding toward your shore in the dawn. Long before the first Viking longship slipped from a fjord into open sea, the Norse already knew what a funeral should look like. It was not invented in wood and pitch, it was dreamed into being through myth. And in no myth is the image of the Viking death ship more powerful, more sacred, or more terrifying than in the story of Balder. Balder the beautiful, Balder the beloved, son of Odin and Frigg, a god without blemish, without sin, whose death was foretold to signal the beginning of Ragnarok, the twilight of the gods. His funeral, as told in the Prose Edda and Poetic Edda, is more than legend. It is the archetype for every ship burial that followed. It is the divine blueprint. When Balder was struck down, betrayed by Loki, pierced by a sprig of mistletoe, Odin and the gods did not bury him in a cold, dark mound. They laid him in a ship, the greatest ever built, Hringhorni, a vessel so vast and so holy that even the gods struggled to move it. They called upon a giantess, Hyrrokin, to help. She arrived riding a wolf, with serpents for reins, and with a single shove, launched the ship into the sea. The gods placed Balder's body upon it, laid beside him his horse and his wife, Nanna, who died of grief. They adorned him with gold and weapons. Odin whispered a secret into his earth contents, never revealed, and placed upon the pyre his magical ring, Draupnir, which would later replicate itself endlessly. Then Thor stepped forward and raised his hammer, consecrating the ship and setting it ablaze. And Hringhorni burned. The flames rose so high they touched the sky. The ship became a chariot of fire, carrying Balder across the sea, beyond the veil, into Helheim, the realm of the dead. For the Norse, this was no fiction. It was cosmic truth. The funeral of Balder was not merely a story about a god, it was a revelation of how the dead should be honored, a sacred model, and it shaped their rites in profound, tangible ways. Every time a longship was set aflame on a fjord, or a warrior laid within its hull surrounded by his sword and steed, the Norse were reenacting Balder's funeral. They were following a mythic script, embedding their own stories within the great saga of the cosmos. The symbolism was layered. Balder, the most perfect among the gods, received the most glorious of farewells. His ship was not only a vessel, it was a bridge. Fire was not destruction, it was transformation. The flames did not consume him. They carried him. So too for the Vikings. A man who died in battle was no ordinary corpse. He was Balder. A king laid in state, surrounded by gold and beasts, was Balder. The ship that burned beneath a twilight sky was Hringhorni. And those who lit the fire were priests of the eternal flame, not mourners. Even the physical layout of Viking ship burials echoed the myth. The central placement of the body, the animal sacrifices, the wealth laid at the feet all found precedent in the death of the god. The practice of sacrificing a wife or companion seen in historical funerals mirrored Nanna's death beside Balder, the whisper from Odin, reflected in the final words spoken by kin before the fire. And when the flames consumed it all, the Norse believed that the ship had not vanished, it had crossed. Balder's story also served another function. It made grief majestic. The gods themselves wept, the world darkened, yet they responded not with hiding or despair, but with ritual. By emulating the gods, the Norse found meaning in mortality. To the Christian chroniclers, such myth was foolishness, yet even they could not deny its power. Stories of burning ships appear again and again in European folklore. Ghost ships, death fires, vessels that sail with no crew. These are echoes of Balder's boat, drifting across the imagination of a continent. The tale of Balder reminds us that the Viking death ship was more than a cultural artifact. It was a cosmic symbol, an enactment of divine narrative. Every pyre on the sea, every ship buried in the earth, was a prayer in flame and oak, reaching back into myth, forward into legend. When the Vikings built a death ship, they were not just honoring a man, they were summoning a god. The fire is long gone, the chanting silenced, the ships have vanished into time. But beneath the moss-covered mounds, in the dark layers of peat and loam, the traces remain. Not in flame, but in iron and shadow. In the careful hands of archaeologists, the Viking death ship speaks again, a ghost of ritual, resurrected in soil and stone. What the Norse created in spectacle, the earth preserved in silence. It begins with rivets, tiny, corroded iron nails, each one a ghost of timber long rotted away. The wood is gone, eaten by time and damp. But the rivets remain in perfect outline, the skeleton of a ship, etched into the land. From these fragments, archaeologists can reconstruct the shape, the size, and often the purpose of the vessel. Whether it was a warship or a ceremonial craft, whether it had been burned or buried whole. Some of the most famous discoveries, Oseberg, Gokstad, Tunahav, yielded nearly intact vessels, their hulls sealed in clay-rich soil that halted decay. These rare finds allow us to see the craftsmanship, the overlapping planks, the graceful curvature, the artistry of the carvings. But more often, we find only shadow traces in the earth, disturbed patterns in the soil, ghostly outlines where oak once lay. And yet, these shadows are eloquent. They reveal how the Vikings engineered the afterlife. The ship was laid in a trench, perfectly measured, with grave goods arranged in deliberate symmetry. Animal bones, horse skulls, pig jaws, dog spines form constellations around the human remains. Swords, bent and scorched, lie across the ribs. Beads still glisten near the skull. In one grave, the remnants of a gaming board. In another, a broken lyre. These are not random remnants. They are ritual blueprints, funerary equations that archaeologists decode piece by piece. In Norway's Borre National Park, radar scans in recent years have revealed massive ship burials still untouched. Giant anomalies beneath the earth, 20, 30, even 40 meters long. Some buried beneath mounds, others resting silently in fields long thought empty. These scans show the scale of what remains hidden. For every ship unearthed, others wait beneath the sod-sleeping vessels, sealed centuries ago by hands that sang as they worked. Burned ships leave different traces. The fire consumes the vessel, but leaves ash layers, scorched soil, and fused metal. In places like Lindholm Hoje in Denmark, rows of stones ship-shaped like vessels but built from upright stones mark cremation sites. Beneath them, layers of charred bone and soil rich with carbon, signs of funerary pyres long gone cold. Archaeologists must read these ashes like runes. Through carbon dating, soil analysis, and microscopic examination, they reconstruct what happened: the time of year, the presence of pitch, the types of wood used, the species of animals burned. Sometimes they find foreign objects, Islamic coins, Slavic beads, Frankish weaponry, suggesting the deceased had travelled far, or at least desired to in death. Even in fragmentary graves, a pattern emerges: careful symmetry, symbolic placement, storytelling through material. One site may hold a broken shield laid over the face. Another, a sword buried point down in the chest. These gestures carry meaning markers of rank, cause of death, or perhaps cosmic orientation. Ship burials were not always isolated. In some areas, they form funerary clusters, graveyards of the elite. Each mound once a ship, each ship once a man or woman whose name echoed across valleys. The layout itself can be ritualized, aligned with stars, with solstices, with waterlines. In Iceland, fewer ships remain. Timber was scarce. But even here, stone ship circles appear, low walls shaped like vessels, graves within their hulls. They speak the same language. We sail in death as we sailed in life. And occasionally, the soil gives more. At Salme in Estonia, the burial of over 40 Norse warriors in overlapping ships revealed not only bones, but trauma, swords through eyes, arrows in vertebrae, skulls crushed. The dead were arranged with honor, but their wounds told of a final stand. From the placement of their bodies, from the items they carried, archaeologists learned not just how they died, but how their brothers remembered them. Modern technology deepens the vision. Ground-penetrating radar, LiDAR, and 3D scanning recreate ships long decayed. Virtual reconstructions bring the burial mounds to life. We see the ship as it was, carved, loaded, surrounded by kin. The firelight flickers again. The chanting rises. For a moment, the grave becomes a vessel reborn. Yet even with all this, mystery lingers. Many burials hold deliberate absences. A ship laid with no body, a sword without an edge, a mound sealed but empty. Were these symbolic burials for the lost at sea, tributes to kings who died far away, or rituals we no longer understand? The earth holds its secrets tight. But every time a trowel lifts a shard of iron, every time a burial mound is scanned and mapped, the ghost of the Viking death ship stirs again, and we are reminded that memory is not always written in words. Sometimes it is carved into wood, scorched into soil, and laid to rest in a trench beneath the northern sky. The longships are gone, their timbers lost to rot or fire, their sails tattered, their prows blackened. The warriors who rowed them, the Cirruses who blessed them, the kings who burned upon them all ash, all earth now. And yet, the Viking death ship never truly sank. Its sails still through story, through stone, through the minds of those who dare to remember. The funeral ship was never just a vessel. It was an idea, a form made from belief, a floating altar that carried not only the dead, but the entire Norse vision of life, honor, and the afterlife. In every grave mound, in every scorched rivet, in every ghostly outline beneath the turf, the same silhouette appears again and again, a hull pointed to the horizon, a soul in motion. The ship that never sank was not built of oak alone. It was built of fire, of myth, of fear, of legacy. Even now, in museums where the Oseberg and Gokstad ships stand restored, their keels raised in artificial light, people approach them in silence. They speak in hushed tones. They walk slowly along the length of the deck, as if afraid to wake something still sleeping in the ribs of the wood. They are not just looking at a boat, they are looking at a rite. They are seeing the body of a story, and they can feel the fire in its bones. The ship that never sank also sails through language, in sagas told at hearths, in modern tales of ghost ships on northern seas, in films, books, and whispered superstitions. Every time a Viking is imagined stoic, bloodied, noble in death, it is the death ship that rises behind him, not as a background, but as the vessel of meaning itself. Even among their enemies, the Vikings are remembered for this: how they died. With fire, with spectacle, with belief. The Christian kings who once feared them, the monks who watched from cliffs as ships burned off the coast they remembered. The stories they wrote, half fact, half trembling, all kept the flame alive. Not just the fear, but the respect. For there was something terrifying in the sight of a people who sang to the gods as they fed themselves to flame. In a world that buried its dead beneath stone, the Vikings sent theirs into fire and water. They did not hide death. They magnified it, and in doing so, they etched themselves into the memory of the world. Their ship, once bound by tide, now sails through time. And so, we look back not just at the archaeology, not just at the sagas, but at the enduring idea that refuses to sink. The belief that death, when faced without fear, becomes more than an ending. It becomes a voyage. A voyage we can still see burning on the sea, trailing smoke into the clouds, its hull dark and silent, its sail full of wind that no one can name. The The Viking death ship remains. It is the ship that never sank,